Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving into a book that's been a cornerstone of military strategy and business tactics, even personal philosophies for centuries. Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
It's amazing how a text written over 2,500 years ago can still feel so relevant today. Sun Tzu's work isn't just about winning battles. It's a deep dive into the very nature of conflict strategy and human psychology.
Exactly, and for those of you who might be thinking, The Art of War, isn't that a bit, well, warlike for me? Trust me, there's so much more to it than that.
Absolutely. At its core, the art of war is about understanding the dynamics of power. Whether it's on a literal battlefield, in a boardroom negotiation, or even in your personal life.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick overview of the book's main themes? What's the big picture here?
Sure, one of the central themes is the importance of preparation. Sun Tzu stresses knowing yourself, knowing your enemy, and understanding the terrain. He emphasizes the role of deception, using indirect tactics to outmaneuver your opponent. And perhaps most importantly, he highlights the power of adaptability, being able to adjust your strategy on the fly to gain the upper hand.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, in any kind of conflict, being prepared and adaptable seems like a pretty solid strategy. But didn't Sun Tzu actually put his principles to the test in a rather dramatic way? Something about using concubines as soldiers?
Yes, that's one of the most famous anecdotes associated with Sun Tzu, though some historians debate its authenticity. The story goes that Sun Tzu was tasked with training the king's concubines to demonstrate the importance of discipline. When they giggled and disobeyed, he made a powerful statement by executing the leaders, even though they were the king's favorites.
Whoa, talk about a tough lesson in discipline. I can't imagine the king was too thrilled about that, even if it proves Sun Tzu's point.
Well, supposedly the king was initially furious, but Sun Tzu argued that in warfare, obedience is paramount. Without it, even the most brilliant strategy can crumble. He saw no difference between leading concubines and soldiers. Discipline was key.
Okay, point taken. So moving into the actual text of The Art of War, where does Sun Tzu begin?
He starts by emphasizing the importance of laying plans. Right off the bat, Sun Tzu argues that warfare is a matter of life and death for a nation, and that careful planning is essential to avoid disaster. He's not glorifying war, he's focused on understanding its complexities and ensuring victory with the least possible cost.
It's fascinating to think about this book being written centuries ago,
Yeah.
and yet these ideas are still so relevant today. I'm already starting to see how these principles could apply to, say, business negotiations or even personal conflicts.
Exactly. It's about thinking strategically in any situation where there's a struggle for power or advantage.
So laying plans is all about thinking things through, understanding the stakes, and not rushing into conflict blindly. What comes next?
The second chapter focuses on waging war, which isn't about battle tactics, but the logistics and economic considerations of conflict. Sun Tzu understood that prolonged warfare could cripple even the wealthiest nation. He emphasizes the importance of achieving victory quickly and efficiently to minimize the drain on resources. There is a famous passage where he meticulously calculates the cost of raising and maintaining an army, highlighting the immense burden that war places on a nation.
So it's not just about winning the battle, it's about winning in a way that preserves your own strength. Almost like a cost-benefit analysis, but for warfare.
Precisely. A true strategist considers the long-term consequences of their actions. Sun Tzu was centuries ahead of his time in recognizing this.
That's really interesting. It sounds like Sun Tzu is advocating for a very calculated and strategic approach to conflict
Yeah.
rather than just brute force.
Absolutely, and that leads us to the third chapter, Attack by Stratagem, where Sun Tzu really dives into the importance of deception and outmaneuvering your opponent. He argues that the best victory is won without fighting at all.
Now that's an idea I can get behind. It sounds like a very judo approach, using your opponent's strength against them. How does Sun Tzu suggest we do that?
He advocates for attacking the enemy's plans, alliances, and morale, rather than engaging in costly head-on confrontations. One of the most well-known lines from The Art of War comes from this chapter. Hence, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It's about being clever and strategic, not just relying on brute force. It makes me think of how often we get caught up in trying to overpower a problem instead of finding a more elegant solution.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder. And recognizing that sometimes the most effective approach is the one that avoids direct confrontation.
So you're saying that the art of war is as much about psychology as it is about brute force.
Absolutely. Sun Tzu believed that the ideal victory is won before the battle even begins. He advocated for undermining the enemy's morale and disrupting their plans through psychological warfare.
That makes sense. You can't outsmart someone if you don't know how they think. How does Sun Tzu suggest we gain that insight into the enemy's mind?
That's where the next chapter, Tactical Dispositions, comes in. Sun Tzu stresses the importance of observation and intelligence gathering. He wants us to be aware of the enemy's movements, their strengths and weaknesses, and their overall strategy.
So it's not just about gathering intel, it's about knowing what to do with it. How do you interpret those signs and translate them into actionable strategies?
That's where Sun Tzu's brilliance really shines. He gives us this fantastic analogy. The quality of decision is like the well-timed swoop of a falcon, which enables it to strike and destroy its victim. It's not about rushing into action, but waiting for the perfect moment, the opportune time to strike.
Almost like a chess player patiently analyzing the board before making a move.
Exactly, and that brings us to the fifth chapter, aptly titled Energy. Sun Tzu talks about harnessing the energy of your troops and using it to overwhelm the enemy. He compares a conquering force to a rushing torrent unstoppable in its power. But he also cautions against letting that energy dissipate or become chaotic.
So it's about having a focused, disciplined force, not just a bunch of enthusiastic but disorganized individuals.
Right, he argues that a large army can be as effective as a small one if it's well organized and its energy is properly channeled. It's about having a clear strategy, a disciplined army, and a leader who can inspire and motivate their troops.
Which makes me think about another key theme we mentioned earlier, leadership. How does Sun Tzu view the role of a leader in conflict?
For Sun Tzu, leadership is paramount. He dedicates an entire chapter 6, to weak points and strong. Here, Sun Tzu reminds us that even the most powerful entity has vulnerabilities. A skilled leader must identify and exploit those weaknesses while protecting their own.
I remember reading this passage in the book. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. That really struck a chord with me. The powerful statement about the importance of self-awareness and understanding your opponent.
Absolutely. That's one of the most famous quotes from The Art of War. And it gets right to the heart of Sun Tzu's strategic thinking. Knowledge, especially about yourself and your opponent, is power.
It's like that old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Exactly. You can't defeat an enemy you don't understand. And Sun Tzu also emphasizes that a leader needs to be adaptable, capable of changing tactics as the situation demands.
So it's not just about having a brilliant strategy. It's about being able to adjust that strategy as needed. Which brings us back to that key theme of adaptability.
Exactly. Sun Tzu understood that warfare, like life, is constantly changing. A rigid, inflexible approach is doomed to fail. You have to be like water flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance.
Okay, so we've talked about planning waging war strategically, the importance of deception, and the role of leadership. What other key insights does Sun Tzu offer?
Well, in the next few chapters, Sun Tzu delves into the practicalities of warfare. He discusses maneuvering in Chapter 7, emphasizing the importance of speed flexibility and anticipating your opponent's actions. This was especially crucial in Sun Tzu's time when armies relied on foot soldiers and communication was slow.
I can imagine that coordinating thousands of troops without modern technology must have been incredibly challenging.
Absolutely. And Sun Tzu provides very practical advice on things like foraging for supplies, choosing advantageous campsites, and recognizing signs of enemy movement.
One passage that stuck with me was about the importance of observing birds. Sun Tzu writes, "The rising of birds in their flight is the sign of an ambuscade. Startled beasts indicate that a sudden attack is coming." It's amazing how observant he was, recognizing that even the smallest details could reveal crucial information about the enemy's intentions.
He was a master of observation and recognizing patterns, which is a valuable skill in any context, not just warfare.
It's about paying attention to the environment, reading the signs, and using that information to your advantage. So maneuvering is about agility and responsiveness. What's next on Sun Tzu's strategic playbook?
Chapter 8 focuses on the 9 variations, where Sun Tzu lays out 9 different types of ground or battlefields and the specific strategies for each. This is where we see his emphasis on adapting your approach to the specific circumstances.
So different terrains require different strategies. You have to analyze the situation and play to your strengths.
Precisely. And he gives specific examples like dispersive ground, which is close to your territory and where troops might be tempted to desert. Sun Tzu advises against fighting on this type of ground because the temptation to go home might be too strong for your soldiers.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want your army thinking about sneaking off for a home-cooked meal in the middle of a battle.
He also talks about facile ground, which is easy to traverse, and where swift movement and pressing your advantage is key. Then there's contentious ground, strategically valuable to both sides, where Sun Tzu warns against attacking an entrenched enemy.
It's like a giant game of strategic chess, analyzing the board and making calculated moves.
Exactly. Sun Tzu recognized that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to conflict. You have to analyze the situation and adjust your tactics accordingly.
So we've got maneuvering battlefield variations. What else does Sun Tzu cover in this section on the practicalities of warfare?
Chapter 9, The Army on the March, focuses on the practical aspects of moving an army, choosing campsites, interpreting signs of enemy movement, and maintaining discipline. Sun Tzu gives very specific advice on things like choosing campsites with access to water and high ground, avoiding areas prone to flooding or disease, and recognizing signs of enemy ambushes.
He even talks about the importance of keeping your troops healthy and motivated, warning against overworking soldiers or allowing them to become complacent.
Exactly. He emphasizes the importance of discipline, clear communication, and rewarding bravery. It's about treating your soldiers with respect, recognizing their humanity, not just as pawns in a game of war.
It's interesting how Sun Tzu weaves in this element of human psychology throughout the book. It's not just about tactics and maneuvers, it's about understanding the people involved, both your own troops and the enemy.
Absolutely. And that leads us to Chapter 10, where Sun Tzu delves into terrain. He categorizes different types of terrain based on their strategic significance, talking about accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, and positions at a great distance from the enemy.
It sounds like Sun Tzu is breaking down the battlefield into its fundamental elements, almost like a chessboard.
That's a great analogy. He analyzes each type of terrain and provides specific advice on how to approach it. He emphasizes the importance of choosing your battleground, carefully exploiting natural features to your advantage, and avoiding terrain that favors the enemy. He also stresses understanding the psychological impact of terrain on your troops. For example, warning against attacking an enemy who occupies higher ground.
So it's not just about knowing how to fight, it's about knowing where to fight. Choosing the right battlefield can be just as important as having a sound strategy.
Precisely, and this focus on analyzing the situation and adapting your approach brings us to one of the most famous chapters in The Art of War. Chapter 11, The 9 Situations.
Ooh, this sounds intriguing. What are these 9 situations?
They build upon the earlier discussions of terrain and battlefield types. We have familiar categories like dispersive ground, facile ground, contentious ground, and serious ground, each demanding a different strategic approach. He also introduces new situations like intersecting highways, where controlling multiple routes becomes crucial, light ground for swift movements, and bad ground, which is difficult to traverse.
So he's taken all these different elements of warfare, terrain, true morale, enemy positions, and categorized them into these 9 scenarios. What does he advise for each situation?
He gives specific guidance based on the unique challenges and opportunities of each situation. For example, on dispersive ground, he advises against fighting, knowing that troops might be tempted to desert. On facile ground, he suggests rapid advancement to press your advantage, and on contentious ground, where the enemy is entrenched, he cautions against a direct attack.
It's all about reading the situation and choosing the right course of action. There's no single right answer. It all depends on the specific circumstances.
Exactly, and that's why The Art of War remains so relevant today. It's not a rule book. It's a framework for thinking strategically, for analyzing situations and adapting your approach based on the variables at play.
It's about being flexible, creative, and always thinking a few steps ahead. Which makes me think about another theme we touched on earlier, deception. Where does that fit into these 9 situations?
Deception is woven throughout Sun Tzu's strategic thinking. He emphasizes it in Chapter 3, Attack by Stratagem, and it comes into play in many of these 9 situations. For example, on contentious ground, where a direct attack is unwise. He might suggest using deception to lure the enemy out of their stronghold, or to create a diversion while you make a strategic move elsewhere.
So it's about using your intellect and creativity to outmaneuver your opponent, not just relying on brute force.
Exactly. Sun Tzu understood that the mind is the ultimate battleground. If you can control the information, perception, and psychology of the conflict, you have a significant advantage.
This is fascinating. It's really making me think about conflict in a whole new light. I'm curious what comes next in The Art of War. What other insights does Sun Tzu have in store for us?
Well, in chapter 12, Sun Tzu takes on a more, shall we say, fiery topic. This chapter is titled The Attack by Fire.
Ooh, fire sounds intense. Is he talking about literally setting things on fire?
Yes, but also, No Sun Tzu outlines 5 ways to use fire in warfare, from burning enemy camps and supplies to creating chaos with flaming arrows. He even gets into the specifics of wind direction and terrain dryness.
So it's not just about starting fires, it's about using fire strategically to achieve your objectives.
Right, but what's really interesting is how he expands on the metaphor of fire. He talks about igniting that inner fire, that drive and passion within your troops.
Ah, so it's about kindling that inner fire, that motivation to overcome obstacles. But wouldn't that make them reckless?
That's where the second layer of the metaphor comes in. Sun Tzu also cautions against being ruled by anger or impulsiveness. He stresses the need for clear-headedness, for making calculated decisions even in the heat of the moment.
So it's about harnessing that fire, that energy, and using it strategically rather than letting it control you. It's a fascinating concept, almost like channeling that intensity into focused action.
Exactly. And finally, we arrive at chapter 13, the use of spies. This is where things get really cloak and dagger.
This is the part I've been waiting for. Espionage is always so intriguing. Didn't he have a whole system for categorizing spies?
He did. Sun Tzu considered spies absolutely essential, believing that knowing your enemy's intentions, what he calls foreknowledge, was the key to victory. He outlines 5 types: local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies who spread misinformation, and surviving spies who gather information.
Well, a whole network of spies. So it's not just about planting spies, it's about manipulating information and creating confusion within the enemy's ranks.
Precisely, Sun Tzu believed a skillful leader could use spies to sow discord, spread rumors, and ultimately paralyze the enemy's decision-making. He stresses treating your spies well, rewarding them, and protecting their identities.
It's about building trust, even in a world of secrets and deception. So looking back over the art of war, it's incredible how Sun Tzu manages to cover so much ground, from grand strategy to the nitty-gritty details of warfare.
His insights into human psychology, the importance of planning and adaptability, the power of deception, these are all timeless principles that transcend the battlefield.
What's amazing is how relevant this book still feels today. Even though it was written centuries ago, it's definitely going on my must-read list.
I highly recommend it. And I think Sun Tzu would be pleased to know that his work continues to inspire and challenge readers across cultures and throughout history.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the art of war. So much to think about. To all you listeners out there, we encourage you to pick up a copy and see what insights you can glean from this ancient text. You might just find that Sun Tzu has a thing or two to teach you about strategy leadership and navigating the complexities of life. Until next time, happy reading.